Rita Clifton, let's hear your introduction.
Can I sit down while doing it?
You may.
Great. I think it's really easy to get very frustrated, even infuriated by the pace of change, or rather the lack of the pace of change on some of these issues. And I know that over the 20 years or so that I've been working with Jonathan Porritt on these issues, whether with the Sustainable Development Commission or otherwise, I wanted to strangle people on a pretty regular basis. But I think what I've also discovered is that people aren't inherently horrid, and also it's difficult to find people these days who don't give a shit about the environment or carbon reduction, etc. But we're also dealing, we need to remember, with the human condition here. And whether we like it or not, from a general point of view, what that means is that people don't necessarily like to change behaviour, particularly if it's going to be maybe inconvenient or more expensive, or maybe they've got lots of other things on their mind at the moment. And I think just as far as research is concerned, one of the complications that we often have to deal with is that people will say in research that they care a lot, that they're going to do stuff, but actually when it comes down to it, their lives may be a little bit more complicated, or otherwise the solutions aren't as accessible, and so therefore they don't do what they say they're going to do. So they're radical at the research questionnaire and reactionary at the checkout, and that's obviously not helpful to the issue. It's also true that if you want people to change behaviour in these areas, you do need to make it really clear what you want them to do. You need to explain why it's so important. And then, of course, you need to provide a solution that is easy, accessible, and not expensive. Now, as far as, again, the carbon issue is concerned, I think that it's easy to see that there are a few challenges on all of those areas. So carbon is not particularly clear to people as an issue, certainly not at the best of times. And sadly, the recent publicity has allowed people to kind of wriggle out of maybe some of their convictions and sense of responsibility. So it's not as simple as maybe people feel that they were being led to believe. Again, that's very annoying, but nevertheless very true. And again, maybe the solutions aren't as easy or as accessible as they would ideally want them to be. So as far as brands and branding is concerned, because obviously that was part of the set of questions that I was asked. I mean, clearly brands can make a huge difference, and also they can, and branding can, to the issue in general. I think as far as brands are concerned, good brands have always been the strongest and most reliable generators of sustainable value from an economic point of view. What needs to happen now is those brands need to be much more sustainable from an environmental and also from a social point of view, and that's obviously a much longer conversation. But of course, what good branding can do is make, again, carbon and some of the carbon solutions feel attractive and engaging. And of course, as far as consumer brands are concerned, indeed corporate brands, they can make the solutions appealing and attractive and accessible. And on that attractive front, I know it sounds rather a strange example to use at the moment, but actually one of the big spikes in carbon awareness was when the Toyota Prius turned up at the Oscars. Remember a few years ago, and some of the world's most glamorous people got out of Toyota Priuses, and suddenly, of course, we had the Hollywoodization of carbon, and suddenly it became a little bit more attractive. Again, we might find this vulgar and irritating, but that's just a normal part of the human condition. And of course, Al Gore has brought Hollywood literally into people's lives on carbon. So there are some upsides.
Rita, can I stop you there? Because you've had your 2 minutes.
Oh, can I just say one more sentence? Am I allowed to?
One more.
I have to choose from a few of these, actually, but shall I do that one? I was just going to say that just the last thing is that a lot of people work in business and also who run brands would ideally like to do the right thing. They're human beings, they recycle, they don't beat their animals and things at weekends. But actually a lot of CEOs and businesses are either worried about how they're going to be judged, either judged at the moment on economic issues, and secondly also they're worried about how they're going to be treated in the media, and maybe that's a longer conversation too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll shut up.
Those Priuses all managed to stop outside the Oscar ceremonies. Let's move on now. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I'm totally in favour of reducing one's carbon footprint, but I couldn't resist it. Dax, Lovegrove, WWF.
Right, 2 minutes. I think people absolutely will care about carbon, but a number of things have to happen first. We need to be much better at sensitising people to the issue of climate change. You know, how are farmers and communities and wildlife really being affected by climate change? And I think we need to get better at the storytelling. Inspiration needs to happen. What is the feel-good factor for taking action on, on a low-carbon sort of lifestyle? I think part of the inspiration piece is also packaging up low carbon with other issues. So if we take food as an example, and we all know food is highly impactful on the climate, food is very personal, it's very values driven, it's all about having better family life, quality of life, it's about eating more healthily, and if you can package that up alongside having lower carbon food as well, then I think that becomes more inspiring. It's about what needs to happen is much more empowerment. People need to feel that their individual actions are part of a collective effort and really making a difference to tackle climate change. And I think part of the empowerment is making sure that people have much more access to low-carbon products and services and lifestyle choices. You know, those things need to be much more accessible. And then the last thing is normalising low-carbon action. You know, the tobacco ban has now meant that it's completely unacceptable to smoke in public places, and it's becoming more and more acceptable, you know, full stop. So if we can shift the social norms so that low-carbon actions is just second nature, everyone's doing it, if, you know, we're going to feel odd if we're not doing it, that's the thing. So then I think if those things happen, people will absolutely care. So then the question is, what's going to make those things happen? Well, surely brands are all about empowering us and inspiring us to do things. That's what they're fantastic at doing. And I would argue that corporate brand communications is probably more powerful than a lot of government communications, and I think they have more reach than NGOs as well. And I think brands can be part of the problem, in which they are fueling a high-impact consumer society. They could be agents of excessive consumption, was the phrase I heard today, or they can be part of the solution and using their massive power of influence to empower us, to inspire us, so that we are much better enabled to take action on a low-carbon agenda.
Thank you very much, Dax. Jo Kenrick.
Yes, very mindful of my 2 minutes. I have 3 things that I was going to put out in the room for your thoughts and questions and challenge. I think the first thing for me is that, might be slightly heretical to say today, but I think carbon and climate change is not the whole story here. I found it very interesting when I was at B&Q and looking after the environmental agenda for B&Q, just how many customers, once you say climate change, switch off. And we found that actually we could access a lot of those people if we either talked in general terms about a sustainable lifestyle. So let's not worry about whether the planet is heating up or not, but let's just think, actually, let's not use something as if it's going to last forever when it won't. That seems to resonate with people, even if they're undecided on the climate change question. And even beyond that, if they still don't want to know, most of the things that you do to save the planet also save you money. And so that's also a key to unlock. So we found that if you can frame what you're doing in a broader sense, then you have a better chance of getting more people to act in the way that you want them to act. I think the other reason that I say carbon is not the whole story, we also found that sometimes doing the right thing for carbon is doing the wrong thing for recycling, and sometimes doing the right thing for carbon is doing the wrong thing for water. And even beyond that, if you want to get really complicated, doing the right thing for carbon can be the wrong thing for some of the fair trade issues and some of the developing world. So we found as an organisation this was a lot more complicated than we thought it was going to be when we got into it. And I think that's really my second point. Having said all of that about carbon and climate change, I don't think is the whole issue. I do think it is very important, but it's very complicated and confusing. Somebody quoted a statistic to me, which I believe is correct, which is that of the UK population, only 0.6% have any kind of chemistry qualification. So that means there's a fairly good chance that the other 99.4% of us aren't quite sure what carbon is, or what embodied carbon is, or what the process is of embodying it or unembodying it, or what that actually means. And I think there is a danger there that people pick up on carbon and carbon footprinting as the thing that people are talking about right now, but not necessarily really understand what it is or what the implications are of some of their actions. And I think that leads me into the third thing I was going to say is I feel, therefore, if you want consumers to care about it, then the responsibility of businesses and brands, and I'm very much with Rita and Tom on this one, is for them to take action. And I think the responsibility of the business and the brand is to try to do all that complicated thinking so the consumer doesn't have to, so you can come out at the end with some simple actions they can take, which they can understand. And for me, a really perfect example of that is the Ariel Turn to 30 campaign. It had never occurred to me, this is pretty daft, I admit, but it had never occurred to me that it would be possible for me to get all my clothes clean if I washed them at a much lower temperature, and that detergents existed that would let me do that. And I think the work that Procter & Gamble did to bring that out to customers, I don't know about you, but I found family, friends, certainly myself, that's a very easy change to make. And a lot of people have made it, and it makes a big difference. So I think brands and businesses have to do that complex thinking up front so that the solution to the customer is simple and easy to understand. And I think the other opportunity for why businesses would be interested in this is, and this is my final thing, it is a massive engine for innovation inside businesses. As Rita said, brands are historically the only real indicator of long-term economic growth in businesses. And if those brands use climate change, environment, sustainability, whatever you want to call it, as a stimulus for innovation, you can make real change. So just to give you one final B&Q example, we had an approach from a very small organisation who were just starting up, who had an idea to create loft insulation in a totally different way. You may have heard of this product, EcoWool. Normal loft insulation, fiberglass. It's not particularly environmentally friendly to produce and is actually very difficult to use. You need protective gloves, goggles, the whole lot. And they had the idea of producing something that had the same insulation properties but could be made from recycled plastic bottles. And not only that, but if you wanted to, it's soft enough to sleep in. I wouldn't recommend that you do, but it is soft enough to sleep in, so you don't need the protective goggles a whole lot. So what you had there was a product has a genuine consumer benefit, isn't more expensive to any significant degree, has the same properties as something you're already using, but far more environmentally friendly. And what B&Q were able to do was support that business in bringing that product to market. And that, I think, is the sort of innovation opportunity that can make a big business difference. So
Thank you.
My bit.
Ruth Girardet.
Thank you. Well, the specific question posed to us was, is climate change changing the way consumers view brands? And I think from our perspective, the answer is yes, absolutely it is. And we can say that wholeheartedly, both for the Tesco brand and for the brands that we sell in our stores. Customers tell us consistently that they want to lead greener lives themselves and that they want to see leadership from the businesses around them. So just very briefly, in terms of the Tesco brand itself, we've recently committed to becoming a genuinely zero carbon business, i.e. one without offsetting, by 2050. We've got very specific targets for the next 10 years, taking us to 2020, reducing our own footprint by 50% in our existing stores, in new stores, and in our distribution network. The latter one is by 2012, so we've got 1 year to go on that. And we're doing very well towards those targets. In terms of our brands, so the items we sell in our stores, there are two things. We are working with our suppliers throughout the supply chain, and we've set ourselves a target to reduce the carbon in the brands we sell by 30% by 2020. So that's upstream. And then the second part is obviously what happens downstream. So again, we've set ourselves a target-driven business to work with our customers to help them reduce their own footprint by 50%. Again, that's by 2020. So we are working both on our own business and on empowering customers to do that, and we have obviously done a lot of work with the Carbon Trust to do so. So, how can brands leverage these opportunities? Again, I'd say to everybody in this room, this is a real opportunity for brands to both show leadership in the way they do their own business and to help customers. I'm sure we'll get into this debate in a bit more detail, but we must, of course, be aware of the complexities. A number of people on the panel have raised it. How much information does a customer really want to have? How many decisions can we expect somebody to make when they're standing there wishing to buy some coffee? and how much of these decisions should we be helping them make behind the scenes. And we're doing a lot of work on that. And I think the three key things that we need to do for the customers, and again, this has been mentioned, I think, in different words, is first of all, don't make the green choice the expensive choice. There's absolutely no reason for that to be the case, because really, if it's a green choice, it should be the more efficient choice, it should be the cheaper choice. Secondly, make the information that you give to customers actionable and empowering. So we know one of the biggest hindrances in behaving green is feeling that your actions don't make a difference, that it's a tiny drop in the ocean. So show people how their actions make a difference. And then thirdly, paint a positive view of the future. If you look at a lot of the green communications they tend to be in terms of things you shouldn't do. So the more we can do to paint a positive and exciting picture of this future, the more I think we can do to get people to participate in it and to wish to be part of that future.
Thank you, Ruth. We've heard a range of views there. Let's hear from you now. Let's have your questions, comments for discussion. If you don't come up with them, I will, and I'm sure you would prefer to do it yourselves. This is where you always hope there's an American in the audience, because Americans always come forward first. Come on, you're marketing people. You do a lot of talking. Let's have your questions. Yes.
Dax, how effective is the likes of Act on CO2 and others? What would you advise governments to do, given that we can't not be the government, to help?
I mean, none of us, the trap sometimes NGOs fall into, and perhaps others, is no one wants to be preached at. And the moment they feel preached at, you almost want to do the opposite of whatever you're being told to do. And I don't know, my feeling is government should perhaps, others might not agree with this, but put more pressure on the corporate brands, because, we can be made to fall in love with trainers quite easily, and that power is enormous. And I don't think government could ever be as effective as a sports brand getting us to fall in love with iPods or trainers or all those sort of consumables that we have in our everyday lives. So I think, there's a role for government to complement that and advise on the rigour and what really we should focus on, what are the high areas of carbon impact. But I do think actually corporate brands will always be head and shoulders above anyone else, because they spend their daily lives researching their consumers, how do the consumers act, what motivates people, and they've got the budgets. So I think corporate brands have the edge on all of us in mobilising change.
Rita, what advice would you give to a government?
I think the first piece of advice is, rather than just lecturing other people on what to do, government needs to be the change it wants to see. So there are loads of government buildings, there's lots of government behaviour, etc., that really ought to be an exemplar for other people. So that would be absolutely the first thing, so to make it coherent. I think the second thing is, as far as corporate brands are concerned, I mean, a lot of companies feel the pressure at the moment, and actually, as I said earlier, a lot of people who are running companies who want to do the right thing, and they'd like to do it faster, and the measurement systems that we've got that apply to companies, which tend, of course, all to be really around financial measures, even though, of course, people talk a good game about triple bottom line, etc., then people are most obviously taken with financial results. So it would help to have broader measures, not only of business, but also, frankly, of society and countries in general. So I think that'll make a big difference. The only thing I'd say, and just coming back to pressure on corporate brands, it is a very, very difficult tension to manage, which is, companies only feel they can move as fast as their consumers are moving. And I'm afraid to say that at the moment, consumers aren't moving particularly fast and aren't saying this is one of the top of their lists of concerns. Now, obviously, what corporate brands need to do is to show leadership. I mean, leadership is an incredibly important characteristic in any great brand, and that's, I think, where brands can make a big difference.
Dax, one more point before I go to Tom.
Very quick point. I think the other point is unusual alliances, actually. It's not always easy to do, but whether it's government and business, or government and NGOs, or business and NGOs, those unusual alliances actually can be very powerful.
Tom.
I'm actually going to suggest something not just for government, but for many of the companies who, in some ways, are misleading us all as we speak. if you go on and you look at any of the carbon calculators available, and many of the NGOs, government and others have carbon calculators, they suggest that your carbon footprint as an individual is 3-4 tonnes of CO2 a year, depending on how much flying typically you do. The reality is that if you take the UK's carbon footprint and you exclude from that, as the UK as a whole, what we export in the way of exported goods, and then you add back in all that we import in the way of imported goods, and you divide it by the population, you'll end up with something approximating to 11 tonnes of CO2. So if we're only responsible for 3 or 4, who's responsible for the remaining 2/3? The simple answer is that there's a very narrow definition in the 3 or 4, which is the stuff that you are directly responsible for, and it tends to be household, a little bit of transport, a little bit of this and that. It excludes, for instance, the buildings that you occupy. Now, most of us either work, go to school, do other things, but we, in some way, go to buildings as part of our daily lives. Most of us enjoy public amenities, public transport, and almost everybody buys something. So actually, if you want to understand your carbon footprint and you understand the positive choices that you can make to try and reduce it, you need to understand what you buy, what you do outside home, and what you do at home. And if you can understand that whole picture, then all of a sudden the realm of positive choices opens up rather than just pointing negatively to the few things you shouldn't do. So it's actually something that I think the government could do better with, but actually I think pretty much everybody else could as well. We've got to tell the whole story, otherwise people are going to get misled.
How feasible is that, Jo?
I find
how
it very.
could the government
yeah.
do an aerial turn to 30, for instance, on the way that Tom is suggesting? It's the government's responsibility to inform the consumer.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it is to do a government aerial turn to 30. I think it's more a question of what brands are being asked to do, or when I've been involved with any brand or business and they're looking at sustainability, what they're trying to do is to give the consumer choices and a clear indication of the impact of the choice. If you want to spend time outside in your garden in the summer, British summers aren't that particularly warm, so you might need something to help you. What might you do? Well, actually buy a patio heater. Do you sell those? Do you not sell those? Do you inform people as to the impact of heating the outside air? Do you persuade them to buy a chimenea or build a fire pit? Or it's about choice. And so for me, actually, what government could be doing in that same way is more information about choice. I do think it's...
Or ban patio heaters.
Well, there are some people who've stopped selling them because they've decided they're just frankly bad. That's a challenge as a commercial choice for any organisation, because what you have in that decision within a business, we all know this if we work in businesses, is a theoretical, this isn't a very good thing to do, against a set of hard numbers that generate a profit that goes to the bottom line that the CEO's job depends on. So, you've kind of got a difficult balance there. But I think giving people choices and information about choices, I've always found is the most valuable way to get behavioural change. What I do think is, and I think somebody referred to it earlier on, a lot of the stuff around this is quite scary. It's about don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other, and by the way, if you do, the seas will boil, the sky will fall, and everybody will be wiped out. That kind of thing I don't personally find very helpful, because when people get frightened enough, they decide that they don't believe it or don't want to believe it or can't do anything about it anyway, and they start backing off from being prepared to change their behaviour. So I think some of the communication around Act on CO2 is a bit scary.
Ruth?
Well, I think that the carbon footprinting project actually shows very well that it is doable and that it is possible to inform customers about the whole impact that their choices can have. So we have now footprinted around 500 products. And we've got about 120 on our shelves. It was a huge change in awareness of the footprint on products when we put it on milk and orange juice, because what physically happens is you've got it on your breakfast table in the morning, and if you have kids or if you're breakfasting with anyone else, they tend to kick off conversations. But what the label does is it absolutely highlights the life cycle of the product, and we don't just use it to inform our customers, we also use it to inform ourselves. So just very brief specific example, when we footprinted milk, One of the things we wanted to find out was whether our distribution systems made a difference. So is local milk a better choice from a carbon perspective than a nationally distributed milk? Now, when you then look at milk and the life cycle analysis, and I'm sure the people here from the Carbon Trust have the technical detail down, so forgive me any kind of slight inaccuracies, but the story is still right. The problem with milk is that it's almost all the footprints in the cow. And whether you distribute it through a national network or whether you distribute it locally actually makes a very, very marginal difference. So in the case of milk, what you need to focus on is what the cow does and how the cow eats. Now, that is clearly not something that the consumer can influence in any great shape or form. So for us, that gives us a very clear... So we have now invested in a project that understands how cows ruminate. Because that is clearly where we are going to make a difference to the carbon on milk.
You are going to stop cows farting?
Well, we are measuring the rate at which they burp,
amazing,
to be very specific.
Really amazing.
But, you know, the example that a number of people have raised before on washing powder, that's a completely different story. With washing powder, almost all of the carbon is in the usage. Almost all of it is in how people wash, how high the temperatures are they wash at, and then whether they dry the product or not. So that is clearly something where we have a huge role to fulfill in terms of informing the customer. So I think the footprinting is a really good starting point for us to understand these choices.
Can I ask you, when you put the carbon footprint mark, do you find products sell more as a result of having it on?
I think we haven't got enough products at the moment to actually give customers a realistic choice to say, actually, I'm going to have that one over that one because the footprint is different. I think ultimately, you know, we would hope that the carbon footprint becomes that the carbon in a product becomes a currency and that it informs choice. But I think the reality is with 120 products, many of which are in the same categories, you wouldn't really see that at the moment.
Okay.
We do find is they tend to often are cheaper, the lower carbon.
Someone over here had a hand up when I asked for questions before. Can we get a microphone over there? Thank you.
Thanks. Hello. I'm Bronwyn Sutton from Partnerships for Renewables. I was just interested to what extent price is used to help people make those choices about carbon. So, I mean, I see a reduction in choice might be helpful, i.e. take away the things that are most carbon heavy, but alternatively, if they must be sold, perhaps they can be loaded. This is more expensive because it is carbon heavy. These things are less expensive because they are less so. Rather than educating everyone, just push them in the right direction.
How much is that feasible, Ruth?
Well, it is. So we have permanently half the price of energy-efficient light bulbs, and that has been a massive change in customer behaviour. It has driven change. We sold 5 light bulbs for 40p one month, and we sold as many in that month as we'd sold in the whole year before. And as I think I said earlier, if your supply chain is working effectively, in many cases, the more energy-efficient product ought to be the cheaper product because it is using fewer resources. So I think to some extent, often green can already be factored into price, and in some instances we can help, absolutely.
I think price is a fantastically important tool to make behavioural change. I think one of the most successful uses of it in recent history was actually the transition to unleaded petrol. But if you remember, then actually the unleaded option was cheaper than the leaded option, and you had fantastic take-up incredibly quickly, and what's more, it's incredibly easily accessible as well. For too long, we've allowed consumers to feel that the green option or the low-carbon option is more expensive, and I think we're having to do a real transition of attitude on that front. And also, I think, just coming back to the government issues, about making sure that we use instruments as far as possible in a positive way, because all too often, just coming back to Joe's point, we use stick, whereas actually we could do with a few more carrots. And price is a very important carrot.
The only thing is, I suppose, if it's all about a cost agenda, you get the rebound effect, don't you? So I had a retailer earlier today who said that they can create massive energy savings with all the low-carbon products they have, whether it's energy-efficient light bulbs or whatever. But then these low-income families, it was a retailer catering for that end of the market, they then sort of save a bit of cash and then they are desperate to fly off to Ibiza. So the kind of the net benefit's completely been lost elsewhere. And the second point is, going back to the idea of sensitisation, When the fantastic programme that Hugh Fernley, what's his name, did, thank you very much. When he sort of took the lady to the farm and to experience the horrific conditions of certain chickens, she came back home and after her horrific experience was perfectly happy to pay double the price of her roast chicken for the family, because then she felt much better about eating the thing. So I just think there are...
But isn't that all very well as long as she can afford double the price, which a lot of people can't?
Absolutely, but this was, she was buying £2.50 chickens because she was a low-income family, but even then she made, she was flexible, and she ended up paying £4.50. So
While the camera was on her.
Maybe, yes.
Tom?
I think I'd make two very quick points. The first is that it's very easy to associate anything that's environmentally sound with something that's going to be more expensive. So organic, we immediately assume, is going to be more expensive than the non-organic, and it pretty much always is. Lower carbon is typically lower cost. And if you look at your shopping basket, the reality is that protein is high carbon and it's generally high cost. So if you go around and you want to do a family shop, if you go for a low carbon shopping basket, the chances are it will be lower cost. I think that's very important. And I do think brands do understand that. I was standing in a very large Tesco store when we actually launched the footprint label on various Tesco's products, and Terry Leahy was alongside me. And when we'd finished and done everything, I did just ask the obvious question. I said, why didn't you choose to footprint some of your finest range? Everybody else sees this as a great thing, so let's add value to something that's already a premium product. And he turned around and looked at me as though I was completely off another planet. And he said, why would we ever want to do that? It's everybody's problem. And I suddenly got absolutely, this is. And I think, to be fair, it is exactly why Tesco actually put the carbon footprint on some of the more mundane day-to-day products in the range, not on the kind of premium products. So actually, I think the biggest challenge with price is not necessarily going for a lower price point to incentivise, as just explaining the fact that low carbon is very often the lower cost solution anyway.
Just to take the point that you were debating about the power of television, I don't know if any of you saw Panorama on Monday night, but I have stopped buying Dove products as a result of watching that programme because it contains palm oil. And what they showed me was Indonesian forest being ruined, and they ended with a very sad and emotive shot of one of the last orangutan left. How much power, Dax, do those kind of programmes have to really change the way consumers view brands?
Well, it's impacted you. So
yeah, clearly.
It had a huge effect. I mean, to be fair, I thought Unilever got a bit of a rough ride because they're in our top 10 of companies who are acting on palm oil, actually, and compared to many, many others who really are not acting on this issue, it's a shame that they got knocked hard, and it's a difficult... I mean, I thought it was a very balanced programme because it did explain the issues, I thought, really quite well, and it's a shame that Unilever came off quite badly, but I mean, I think it's hugely powerful. That can sensitise us massively. And if we get attached to orangutans, but also the communities in Borneo who do actually require livelihoods, and actually sustainable palm oil provides them with good livelihoods, as well as protecting the local environment. But I think it can have massive power.
Yeah. Chap there. Just wait for a microphone.
It certainly picks up on that example. But it also goes back to the point you made, Joe, right at the beginning, which was talking about the low level of chemistry understanding within the population, and this whole thing around climate change, carbon, etc. I think there's a real creative tension between the topic, which so far is quite a scientific, rational one, and brands which are, where they really resonate is at an emotional level, and emotion you've seen in the context of the orangutan and so on. So I suppose the question is, in communicating with consumers, how much should brands take on the science bit, if you like, and how much should it look to tell stories, going back to Dax's point, and leverage the emotional resonance?
Joe?
I think that's a really good point, and I've certainly found in the past in dealing with it that it's almost bizarre as a communications industry that for decades we have convinced ourselves that if we measure the rational responses of people to pieces of communication that we put out, that will give us some indicator as to their behaviour. And actually their behaviour is pretty much entirely driven by emotional decision or emotional reactions to things, which are nothing to do with the rational stuff that they would feed back to us in research groups. So I think my personal sense is that the emotional piece is much more powerful, far more powerful. But I think that for me, where the emotion ties back into the science stuff is the emotion of feeling kind of almost embarrassed or uncomfortable because are you the only one who's stupid and doesn't understand this stuff when everyone else seems to, or feeling that you're not really quite sure what the right thing is to do. You'd like to do the right thing, but there's too many different choices and options and lots of different ways of talking about it, and you just don't really know, and it's all quite scary. And I think there are emotional reactions layered within that can drive behaviours. So for me, I guess my personal view would be there needs to be enough science for it to feel true. But I would rather that the complication happened within the business or the brand, and that therefore what all the customers saw on the far end of it was something simple and something easy that says we've already done your thinking for you, so if you want more information on it we can provide it, but you don't need that information because the simple answer is this.
How much, Ruth, are consumers, your consumers, suffering from information overload? You know, I mean, you go into the supermarket, you're a busy parent, you've got to look at the fat, the sugar, the fair trade, the carbon. You probably don't understand the science. You're just going to buy the Walker's crisps because you know you like Walker's crisps, not because they've got a carbon footprint on them.
Yeah, and not only do you have to look at all these things, you also then have to form a view about whether you happen to think it's more important that this chicken has been reared in a happy context, or whether it is more important that it's been reared in an energy-efficient context, which might well be a battery farm, and so on and so on. I mean, I think that's a really important.
Is really stressful.
It's a really important piece of the debate, and I think it's one that we need to take very seriously. I think, just to the previous question, I think storytelling is a hugely important part in all of that because it makes it easier to come out with a single narrative. I think one of the reasons why we're working with our suppliers to reduce carbon in the supply chain is because in some instances we can make these choices. We can reduce carbon in our supply chain without needing to explain to the customer that in this particular case it was the cow. I do also think that information, however, is a vital part of sustained behaviour change, because I think for those people who do want to know, it has the longest term effect in terms of behaviour change to actually know why you're doing it. And I think GDA labelling is a really good example of that. So if you look at the amount of people who understand what their daily calorific intake should be and who understand that certain products are better or less good for them, and the short amount of time in which we've really had this, you can see why information can be a very powerful piece of driver of behaviour change.
But I mean, Tom, given that there is so much information there and that consumers may well be confused about it, what do you say to the consumer who says, oh, well, you know, we've had the worst winter ever. You know, what's all this climate change? Where's all this heating going on?
That's a very difficult question because, you know, trying to explain the difference between weather and the climate is not something that's very easy. At times it's easy for us to say, look...
But you're hearing that all the time at the moment.
We are hearing it a lot more. And the businesses we work with are hearing it an awful lot more. I think most people are saying, look, you know, in the long run, the science underpinning climate change is pretty sound. It's real, sadly. It is largely caused by us. And we do have the solutions. I think actually the most important thing right now is to focus on we do have the solutions. We can actually paint a future of a low-carbon society that is a great place to be. It's an optimistic place. It's a positive choice. I think one of the problems at the moment is that one can retreat into, look, if we actually tackle this problem, it's going to be bad for everybody. There's no reason to believe that at all.
Given the scientific ignorance that we've heard about,
yeah.
How would the Carbon Trust tell stories to convince people that they need to care about this?
It's something we've never done. We've always taken the science as pretty much read, and we've worked from the basis the science has been proven. And over the last decade, we've seen an increasing level of carbon awareness, an increasing understanding of the science, and an acceptance that it's real and that it needs to be tackled. If it were, let's just say that the current, and it's been the last few months now, malaise in this area, continues for an extended period, then I think we and others would have to start thinking, look, hang on, we've got a big issue here to which we have a solution, and we haven't brought people along with us. Now, how do we do that? How do we tell that story? We are a long way from that. How we do it is probably by example. We probably have to pick on the emotional tags and make sure the facts underpinning the emotion are right. I mean, you were very touched by the last orangutan, but largely, I think, because you understood or you were told it was the last. The sense was, there's the fact, it's the last, and suddenly this becomes enormously important to you. If you knew there were 300,000 of those, we turn around and say, well, it's one of 300,000.
Yeah, they didn't film the other 300,000.